A day after the Super Bowl, an anonymous hacker leaked the personal information of 20,000 FBI employees and over 9,000 Department of Homeland Security employees. A week later, UK authorities said they had arrested a teenager for releasing that information, as well as for hacking the personal email account of CIA Director John Brennan. On today's Cyber Chat, we talk with Leo Taddeo, the CSO of Cryptzone and former special agent in charge of special operations of the Cyber Division of the FBI's New York office. We chat about the recent government attacks, the FBI's role in investigating data breaches, and what is changing in cybercrime. To kick things off, there was some recent news about the FBI and FBI employees and DHS employees having some of their information leaked. I don't know if you've really followed that story, and you can maybe recap and fill us in a little bit on what you know about that.
Right. So I think the story originated in an online article, Motherboard, and I read and reread the article. Some of it makes little sense. I mean, I can't make sense of some of it. I think the author of the article could have done a better job in either verifying the facts or writing it in a way that made it clear as to what he knew or what was provided to him. But at the end of the day, apparently there's some information about FBI employees that is in the hands of someone who shouldn't have it. And it appears to be names and email addresses and job titles, which, could indicate that someone had access to a mailing list or a contact list in an email account. According to the article, the hacker socially engineered an IT help desk to provide a one-time password, a token. And so that would indicate that it was a compromise in protocol. But there's also the question of how they got the original account credentials, and that's also troubling. So we really don't know a lot about how this information was obtained. The article isn't very clear, but it's possible that there was some social engineering done to obtain username and password, and further social engineering done to gain a token, which was used to access an account. And what we're seeing, or what is claimed by Motherboard, is the contact list from that account. So it doesn't appear that, from what I take from it, it doesn't appear that someone was actually able to defeat, on a technical level, two-factor authentication. It came from a socially engineered attack, which is equally effective if done right, of course, but it requires less technical skill. And in this case, it doesn't look like the hackers had used the technical tools to get the information that they claim they have. Instead, they just used some old, good old-fashioned tricks to get somebody to give them the material they needed to gain access to it. So that's my take on it after reading the article. And I can go through it step by step. What's written just doesn't make much sense. They talk about accessing a DOJ portal and then getting access to a virtual machine online. That doesn't make sense to me. And being presented with 3 different computers, that doesn't make sense. And then getting on the DOJ intranet. None of that comports with my understanding of how remote access is done for the FBI or the DOJ. So there's either some garble in what the hacker is telling the reporter, or they're purposely trying to make it to cover their tracks is what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think it's something we probably, at least from my perspective, I know, you used to work for the FBI, correct?
Yeah, I did work for the FBI. I was an FBI special agent for more than 20 years, and in my last assignment, I was the head of the Cyber and Special Operations Division in New York field office.
Yeah, and I was going to say, because then, I would imagine in your position, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine you get a little more information about the specifics of these attacks. I mean, you mentioned that some of this sounds incorrect, and I think from people maybe on the outside, it's kind of common. You read these articles, and they're a little vague or a little confusing as to what happens. But I guess kind of moving on a little bit, I don't know if you saw just this week, I believe, one of the people behind the Crackers with Attitude was arrested in the UK. That's the group that they targeted CIA Director John Brennan and some other high-profile officials. So there's been a lot of kind of similar attacks lately of people kind of going after some of these government employees. OPM obviously was a big story last year. So just wondering if you have any sense of like the motivation behind that, or what people are trying to accomplish, or if they're just doing it because they can, or.
Yeah, sure. No, there's a lot of different motives behind it. I mean, if you look at the OPM breach, that was a very sophisticated technical attack that took several months to execute, and maybe even more than several months to execute. So, and it was done using some very sophisticated tools and some very sophisticated techniques by a very patient and persistent adversary with some really good technical skills. Totally different from what we see with the recent attacks, which are some well-crafted, socially engineered techniques to get credentials to get into some of these systems. So different motives, different levels of sophistication. The motives, according to the hackers in the case with John Brennan, were to raise awareness to issues that they said they cared about. That may not be true. It may be true. It may not be true. Sometimes these hacks are done by people who want to test their ability or gain notoriety for themselves or impress their friends. And we really don't know in detail until we knock on their door and with some type of charge and arrest them and ask them or gather some other evidence as to their true motive. So a lot of these folks at the end of the day don't realize that they are gaining a lot of attention from law enforcement, and at the end of the day will likely spend some time in court or in prison answering for it. And these aren't, in my experience, these aren't hardened criminals, meaning that they aren't the type to stand up well in a prison environment, and they realize that what they've done is very serious at some point, and they do cooperate, and they do tell us what they did and how they did it and who else did it. So it's a dangerous game for them to be in. I think they don't realize the risks that they're taking. When you poke, if you poke a law enforcement agency and tempt them to respond, chances are that they will, and they will put resources to find you. And it's usually the case that people wind up in much more serious trouble than they realize. So it may seem like they are skillful and clever until they are finally arrested. Most of them are younger and don't realize how much trouble they can get in, and they eventually, cooperate and help the government at the end of the day figure out what happened.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you did at the FBI and sort of what the FBI does, because, I read about these cybercrime events every day, and you always hear, the FBI notified this company of a data breach, or the FBI is investigating. And so we always hear about the FBI on the periphery of all these things. I wonder if you could explain maybe a little bit about what actually happens in regards to these data breaches.
Right. So the FBI has a number of responsibilities in the cyber domain, and one of them is to investigate cyber crimes, both criminal cyber activity and national security-related cyber activity. So that would be, for example, hacks like the OPM hack, which there's evidence that it was done by a nation state, China in that case. And through that investigative work, we gather a lot of information, including information about ongoing hacks. So you can imagine that, as I mentioned before, some of the hackers that we arrest in order to help themselves at sentencing enter into agreements with the government where they will provide information about hacking activity that perhaps the government doesn't know about. So in that sense, we sometimes get insight into hacking activity before the victim even knows they're being hacked. So we might, for example, arrest someone within a hacking group, and they cooperate and tell us who is hacking and who they are hacking. And we use that information to go out sometimes and tell the victim that they are being hacked and they ought to take steps to protect themselves. So that's just one example of how the FBI can get some insight into ongoing hacking activity before the victim does. There are other ways, so there are hacking forums. There are ways that we can collect information as it's traveling across various, and this is done lawfully with court orders, of course. But we do have some intercept authorities that allow us to intercept communications and some network traffic that allows us to determine some of the malicious activity out there. Again, court authorized and in full compliance with privacy and other constitutional protections. So that's our investigative role. We have an intelligence gathering role as well. We have a mission to help the private sector protect itself. We have a mission to protect infrastructure. And we have our own IT challenges. So as the agent in charge of cyber and special operations, I had the investigative piece, I had the IT support piece, I had some of our intercept and collection capabilities, and I had some of our support functions as well to other missions. So from that perspective, I got to see quite a bit of the cyber tools that are out there, some of the cyber actors that are out there, and some of the motivations of these cyber actors, which is very, very much helpful to us in figuring out what they're doing and take steps to prevent them from doing it.
I'm wondering then, obviously you probably have more of a finger on the pulse of what was going on then when you were there. So is there anything that I guess really surprised you or stands out when you look back on that time in terms of different cases or different motivations or actors or anything to do with cybercrime?
Yeah, sure. So much of it is surprising in a way. So I was surprised by the number and the energy and the sheer volume of activity by hackers. There are a number of low-level hackers, a high number of mid-level hackers, meaning the criminal groups, and a surprisingly active group of state actors that are conducting attempts to enter into our networks. So I was surprised just how much of the world is under attack and how many hacking attempts there are, and some of them very successful. I was also surprised at the success of some of the attacks and how the attacks were able to defeat some pretty smart people who worked really hard to keep their networks safe. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how it was that despite great effort and despite really good technical tools, that enterprises were still getting hacked. And that, to me, was another continuous surprise. That every morning we'd read about some intrusion that defeated what appeared from the outside to look like a well-run network, well-defended network. And at the end of the day, I started to form the opinion that too much time is being spent preventing attacks at the perimeter. I think there was a lot of emphasis, perhaps too much emphasis, on perimeter defense, signature-based defenses, and countermeasures. I feel strongly that there's too much time and effort in the signature-based approach because there hasn't been a hack in the last 10 or 15 years that didn't get past antivirus, that didn't get past perimeter defenses. So you can't find a hack. I challenge you to find a hack on a major enterprise that didn't beat antivirus. It gets beat every time, and yet it's required. There's a lot of money spent on it. So those were the surprises, the volume, the ease of obtaining valid credentials, and how easy it was to get past the perimeter defenses that are out there, and how much money and time is being spent on that perimeter despite the weakness of it.
Now you're working at Cryptzone. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and what you guys do over there.
Yes, great, thanks. So Cryptzone is a cybersecurity company. We make a number of cyber security products. Our lead product is an enterprise gateway, which means it controls the user access to network resources, meaning a user has to go through our appliance in order to get to resources on the network. And like I said before, I was surprised at the ease of penetrating perimeter defenses, and when I saw the technology that Cryptzone had developed, it was really, really compelling. I think the approach that Cryptzone is taking is the right approach because it's more about making it harder for the adversary to do things like reconnaissance and lateral movement, rather than try to prevent them from getting in from the perimeter, which it's very effective in doing. Even if they get in to the perimeter, they can't move laterally. They can't do reconnaissance. They can't escalate privileges. which are essential steps in a sophisticated attack. So I found the Cryptzone technology very compelling. It's one of the reasons why I left the FBI. I thought that the approach that Krypton was taking had the right equation, meaning we transfer complexity and cost to the adversary. Right now, it's very expensive to defend networks. It's very cheap to hack into a network. The risks are low for hackers and the rewards are high. We need to change that equation. We need to make it more expensive and harder for a hacker, more risky for a hacker. And so how do you do that? Many companies are focused on the perimeter, and I think that's a mistake. I think we need to harden the interior. I think we need to protect the resources in the interior, and we have to assume that an adversary can obtain valid credentials. So we need to think a little differently, and I think Cryptzone has the right approach, the right strategy in protecting resources by creating a very fine-grained connection, and we'd call it a microsegment, between the user and the network resource. I know that's a little technical, but at the end of the day, what we really do is lock down the user to the resource that they're authorized to have, and we do it in a way that's very efficient, and we do it in a way that prevents lateral movement, reconnaissance, and escalation of privileges.
Yeah, then my final question, I'm always interested to hear what people kind of think going forward, because cybercrime is always evolving and always changing. So just wondering if there's anything that stands out either currently or, what you think could possibly change going forward in terms of cybercrime.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things happening that make it harder for networks to defend themselves and make it harder for law enforcement to prevent this type of activity. And those are the increased use of encryption in normal communications and the ability for people to remain anonymous in these hacker-for-hire markets. I think the hacker-for-hire market and the malware market and the botnet markets are adding to the problem, and it's an anonymous forum, meaning that criminals can meet customers and neither side knows who they're dealing with, and neither side can know because of the obfuscation and the encryption involved. So those kinds of technical advances protect privacy, of course, but they also make it a lot harder for law enforcement. I think going forward, it's going to make it a lot harder for networks to defend themselves, because at the end of the day, cybercrime has become an industry. Cybercrime is no longer being perpetrated by individuals with some technical skill and the kid in the basement, or even the insider with some technical skill. Cybercrime is now big business for big criminal groups who are devoting money into research and development, into building specializations like money laundering departments and malware development departments and infrastructure support departments. And because of this specialization, they're becoming more efficient, they're becoming more effective, and the profits are going up. And as they make their profits, they're turning those profits back into the organization and becoming even better at it. So cybercrime as a big business is getting more powerful, and it's getting to be more of a threat to all networks, government networks, private networks. So I think the trend is against this, and I think having dark web forums and obfuscation like Tor and encryption on normal everyday communications devices, encryption that can't be broken, makes it that much harder for law enforcement to investigate and to create a viable deterrent to this type of activity. So again, it's all about changing the equation, transferring risk, transferring complexity to the adversary, which we are having a very difficult time doing. Again, it comes back to why I joined Cryptzone. I think Cryptzone hardens the interior in a way that makes it much harder for the adversary. It does so in a very cost-effective way, which, again, changes the economic equation on it. And I think that's really what it's all about. As long as the money is motivating the criminal actors, they will continue to develop tools. They will continue to put a lot of people to work in this field, meaning they'll hire a lot of hackers and point them at our networks. As long as that's done with relative impunity, meaning law enforcement can't catch them or identify them, then it'll continue to grow. And I think we'll have this problem for a very long time.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Leo. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that wraps up this week's Cyber Chat podcast. As always, the Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact of their business, and proactively address threats head-on. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.